In the summer of 1837, a 28-year-old scientist sat in his study and scribbled 2 words at the top of a notebook page: "I think." Beneath them, he drew a crude, spindly tree. This diagram illustrates a departure from the science of the era. Instead of isolated silos, it maps a connected lineage. One ancestor gives rise to new species, splitting and branching over deep time to build the staggering diversity of nature. He knew exactly what this drawing meant. Instead of sharing his work, Charles Darwin locked the notebook away and kept his mouth shut for the next 2 decades. To understand his silence, look at Victorian England. The rigid societal and scientific consensus of the 19th century was governed by fixism. This was the absolute belief that every creature on Earth was created by God exactly as it appears today, completely unchanging. To suggest that animals morphed and adapted on their own was career suicide. By drawing that tree, Darwin realized he was threatening the religious and scientific foundations of his entire world. The thought terrified him, triggering an internal war of anxiety that forced him into a double life. That notebook sketch didn't come from a sudden flash of genius. It was the result of a 5-year global expedition aboard the HMS Beagle, where Darwin slowly accumulated a collection of geographic and biological anomalies. While mapping the coast of Chile, he witnessed a violent earthquake. When the tremor stopped, he found marine life stranded high above the water, the seismic force physically thrusting the coastline upward. Over immense periods of time, the Earth itself was transforming. Months later, the Beagle anchored at the Galapagos Islands. Surveying these barren, volcanic landscapes, Darwin noticed that life here was incredibly harsh and completely isolated from the mainland. He spoke with the local governor and learned a strange fact about the giant tortoises roaming the archipelago. You could tell exactly which specific island a tortoise came from just by looking at it, because the animals possessed completely different shell shapes, uniquely adapted to their local terrain. A rising coastline in South America and a uniquely shaped tortoise shell in the Galapagos were no longer isolated anomalies. They were evidence that an ever-changing Earth forces its inhabitants to physically change with it. Back in London, Darwin knew species changed, but he had to figure out how. Leading French scientists like Jean-Baptiste Lamarck argue that animals transformed through an inner drive, actively striving toward physical perfection. Darwin rejected this idea outright. This chart illustrates the insight that moved his work forward. Inspired by the grim efficiency of English factories and the writings of economist Thomas Malthus, Darwin mapped population growth against available food. When a rapidly multiplying population collides with a flat line of limited resources, life becomes a brutal mathematical competition for survival. He called it natural selection. In an overcrowded world, creatures born with a slight accidental advantage, a slightly longer beak, a slightly thicker shell, win the fight for food. They survive the resource drop and pass that winning trait directly to their offspring. He had the mechanism, but he also knew the scientific elite would attack anyone proposing a world governed by random biological competition rather than divine design. He was particularly terrified of men like Richard Owen, a brilliant but arrogant anatomist who aggressively crushed dissenting theories. To survive the coming onslaught, Darwin needed a reputation that could withstand scrutiny. So he stalled. He spent 8 years classifying thousands of barnacles, intentionally building a resume as an elite world-class zoologist before daring to publish his actual theory. Holding this secret took a toll on his health. He suffered from panic-like symptoms, extreme nausea, and severe palpitations. Unable to handle the stress of London, he retreated to Down House, a quiet country estate that became his physical and psychological fortress. Then, in 1851, his beloved 10-year-old daughter Anne contracted scarlet fever and died. The loss devastated him. It shattered whatever remnants of religious faith he had left, pushing him into a firm, lifelong agnosticism. He spent years meticulously drafting his argument in private, terrified of getting it wrong. But in 1858, a package arrived in the mail that forced his hand. Inside was an essay written by a young naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace. Darwin read it and nearly collapsed. Wallace had independently figured out the exact same theory of evolution by survival of the fittest. The threat of being scooped broke his paralysis. The fear of losing 20 years of agonizing secret labor finally overrode his dread of societal backlash. Darwin had to rush his theory into the light. In November 1859, he published On the Origin of Species. The initial run sold out instantly. The 20-year secret was out, proving that all species were descendants of common ancestors, modified over deep time. The book split Victorian society. Darwin despised public conflict and stayed isolated at Down House. Instead, he relied on aggressive allies to fight his battles in the press and the lecture halls, most notably the biologist Thomas Huxley, who happily acted as Darwin's bulldog, publicly dismantling critics like Richard Owen. With the groundwork laid, Darwin eventually published The Descent of Man, making his most dangerous assertion yet. He placed human beings directly onto the exact same evolutionary tree as animals, governed by the very same biological rules. While he held deeply flawed Victorian biases regarding race and gender, he fiercely rejected the twisting of his work into social Darwinism. Some politicians tried to weaponize natural selection to justify cruelty, arguing the weak should simply perish to strengthen the species. Darwin found that logic absurd. He wrote that in human evolution, brutal competition wasn't our saving grace. Empathy, cooperation, and our capacity to care for the weak were actually humanity's most successful and noble evolutionary advantages. He spent his final decade quietly in his garden, endlessly curious. He tracked the micro-movements of climbing plants and studied the soil habits of earthworms, having found peace with his monumental life's work. When Charles Darwin died in April 1882, he wasn't shunned. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, resting near Isaac Newton, in a physical honoring of a man who once feared his ideas would destroy his life. His dangerous secret didn't strip humanity of its value. By proving we are a living, breathing branch on an ancient tree, Charles Darwin permanently grounded us in the deeply interconnected web of life.